Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. We're in the middle of harvest at the moment, with winter barley and winter oats largely complete. Most other crops of oilseed rape and early sown spring barley are now ready for harvest as soon as the weather settles down a little. Where fields of winter barley or oats are cleared, this creates an ideal opportunity to plant a cover crop. We know cover crops are useful for many different functions on the farm, but many farmers also see them as an inconvenience both to plant and manage before the next crop. Richie Hackett, a researcher in Teagasc Oak Park, has been working with cover crops for over 10 years and joins me today to go through some of his findings, especially the advantages of planting cover crops early. Richie, you're very welcome to the podcast. And I first want to talk to you about the terminology around planting a crop, as in the crop between one main crop and the next crop. These can be called cover crops, catch crops, green cover. You might maybe explain the differences between them.
I suppose, as you said, they're all about maintaining something, a growing plant between two main crops. So say if we're growing spring barley after spring barley, the ground would normally be left bare over the winter period. But when we talk about these cover crops or natural regeneration, we're talking about maintaining something growing there over the winter period. And I suppose the main difference is whether we're just allowing whatever would normally regrow after the harvest to grow, or whether we're actually sowing something. So where we're just leaving something to grow naturally, we call it natural regeneration. But where we're sowing an actual seed into the soil, we would call it a cover crop or a catch crop. And then once we start sowing seeds, there's a range of names that are used, such as cover crops, catch crops, green manures, and I suppose they're all exactly the same, mean they're exactly the same, but I suppose the different names would have arisen based on what objective was trying to be achieved by growing the crop. So for example, the catch crop would have been grown to catch nutrients. That would have been where that term would have arisen from. A cover crop would have arisen from where you were trying to protect the soil from erosion, either wind erosion or water erosion. So it really comes down to the function. A green manure is where you're growing the crop to actually provide some benefit to the next crop. But they're all essentially the same thing. They're exactly the same. The same crop could be called the three different terms, so that they all mean the same thing.
Okay, so you pointed out, Richie, one of the things that a cover crop can do in terms of protecting the soil, but it obviously can play or can have a few more functions, if you like, for the farmer. You might just give us an idea about those kind of main functions.
Well, I suppose in our environment, probably the principal function of a vegetation over the winter period is to reduce nutrient loss via leaching, or prevent nutrients being washed out of the soil over the winter, because obviously we get quite a lot of rainfall over the winter, very little evaporation. So all that rainfall is moving down through the soil and carrying any nutrients that are in the soil. If we put in a growing vegetation, it's going to soak up those nutrients. And the main one we're talking about is nitrate. That's the one that there are issues about, particularly in the south and southeast of the country, in the rivers in those areas. But I suppose as well as that, that there are a number of other functions. I mentioned it can prevent either wind or water erosion. I suppose water erosion will be the main issue in our climate again. They can have an improving effect on soil structure. The presence of the growing roots in the soil can help maintain or improve soil structure. There is the potential to increase nutrient supply to the next crop, and thereby reduce your fertilizer inputs. But I suppose the other one as well that a lot of people grow them for is to improve organic matter, or to improve the soil quality or the soil health. And they can have some benefits in that regard as well.
Okay, so if we maybe just focus on the organic matter first for a moment, how significant is the amount of cover that the crop can grow in a particular year? And if we just maybe put that in comparison to what a farmer can visualize, so something like, say, putting on a reasonable application of farmyard manure.
Yeah, well, they can provide reasonable amounts of carbon. So if we were to take, say, a 25 tonne per hectare application of farmyard manure, which is a reasonable dressing of farmyard manure, you might expect that would be putting in something like 2.5 tonnes per hectare of carbon into the soil. A cover crop, a sown cover crop, so something that's sown, say, mid-August, you might expect it to produce 3 tonnes of dry matter by say Christmas, and that would be putting in sort of the order of 1.2, 1.3 tons per hectare of carbon back into the soil. So roughly half what you're dressing of farmyard manure. And if we compare it to straw, I suppose a lot of straw being chopped this year, it would be a little bit, if we were to take a 3 ton or 7.5 ton per hectare spring barley crop, say, that if you chop in the straw of that, it might be putting in 1.8, 1.9 tons of carbon versus your 1.2, 1.3 from your cover crop. So it's a little bit lower than, say, a straw where straw is chopped, but it's still a potentially significant amount of carbon.
Okay, yeah, it is quite a lot. And then when you think about that, obviously there's you mentioned that nitrogen is going to be mopped up. So for that organic matter that is trapped, if you like, how will that decaying organic matter supply the next crop, or can it supply the next crop with the nitrogen that it trapped in that year?
It can supply some. The problem is the effects are very variable. So we've done quite a bit of work on that back through the years. And where you have a non-leguminous cover crop, so something like mustard or phacelia or radish or something like that, it's quite difficult to show nitrogen benefits in the next crop on a consistent basis. Yes, you can show them in occasional years, but it's very hard to show them in a consistent basis. And unless you can show them in a consistent or a predictable basis, it's very hard to reduce your nitrogen accordingly. But they can. I suppose one of the more recent bits of work that we're doing is where we're looking at legumes and the potential of those to provide nitrogen to the succeeding crop, and they're showing a lot more potential to provide nitrogen to the succeeding crop.
Okay, and when we talk about nitrogen, you mentioned earlier about the if you like, the free nitrogen or the nitrogen in the soils at the end of the season that is there and a potential to be leached. What sort of leaching can happen on a free draining soil, and how much of that potential leached nitrogen can a cover crop retain in a particular year?
Well, the amount of nitrate being leached is highly variable. It'll really depend on how much nitrogen is left in the soil after the crop is grown. But I mean, 80, 90, 100 kilos per hectare it wouldn't be common, but it's entirely possible, particularly on light free draining soils, and if a lot of fertilizer has been applied to the previous crop. But where you put in a cover crop, you'd be looking at reducing the amount of the kilos per hectare of nitrate being lost by 50-60% if you get good growth of the cover crop, at least 50 to 60%. But then if you've got relatively poor growth of the cover crop, that figure will reduce. So the cover crop can reduce the amount being lost quite significantly, particularly if there's good growth of the cover crop.
Okay. And so when you're, and we'll come to this in a second in terms of the time of sowing, it has a big influence on the amount of dry matter that is produced in a year, the amount of, I suppose, overall bulk of growth in a cover crop in a particular year. If a farmer was to go out, say in September or October, say, and he's to assess the cover crop that might be in the field, can the farmer equate the amount of dry matter or amount of material, fresh matter material that's there, to the amount of nitrogen that's possibly captured in that crop?
That's a difficult question. But what I would say is if there was just one crop in the field, so if it was just, say, mustard, it might be possible to develop a sort of a rule of thumb that would allow you to equate the two. In other words, if you had X amount of dry matter, you'd have Y amount of nitrogen. But the problem is when you have multiple different types of cover crops, so you might have mustard in one field, phacelia in another field, they're quite different in their sort of nitrogen dry matter relationship. And then to make things even more complicated, many people are growing mixtures, which makes it even more complicated. Again, there is some work ongoing abroad trying to relate those two and trying to do it using satellites and that sort of thing, but it's at an early stage.
Okay, so more work to be done on that for sure.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned, before we kind of get on to your experiments, just one last word maybe on, you mentioned cover crops and some people are looking at them towards I suppose helping the soil and soil health. Have you done any work on that, Richie, or where might that come into play?
We have looked, so I suppose soil health is a very broad term and encompasses many different aspects of what goes on in the soil. We have looked at some of them. I mentioned the carbon effect. So I said, a 3 ton per hectare a cover crop might return 1.2 tons per hectare of carbon to the soil. Now, not all that carbon is retained, only about 20% of that will actually be retained on any sort of long-term basis by the soil. But that carbon will tend to feed the microorganisms in the soil. It'll also help, it provides food for earthworms. We have looked at the effect of cover crops on earthworms, and in a relatively short-term trial over 3 years, we didn't find huge effects of cover crops on earthworm numbers. There was some effect, but it was fairly modest. But yes, they will have a positive effect on soil health over time, but it will be modest, as will all effects of cover crops. You really need to do it year after year after year for a good number of years before you'll get significant positive effects on any aspect of the soil.
So when we then turn to some of the work that you're done in Oak Park, or you most recently produced a video that's up on the Teagasc Crops YouTube page, that gives a really brilliant and very visual look at the time of sowing and the influence that can have on the amount of cover crop that's going to end up in the end. You might just give us a little bit of a background to that trial in terms of the planting and maybe the types of crops that you used for that trial, and maybe why you picked those crops in particular.
Yeah, well, I suppose there was a lot of people asking, just how big an effect does sowing time have on cover crop growth? So we decided to do this trial just to look at that. And we were looking at sort of the normal range of sowing dates that you might have for cover crops. So we looked last day, or 30th of July, as sort of being a very early date, only possible really after say winter barley or winter oats. We looked at sort of a mid-August sowing date, which might be possible after spring barley and sort of a normal harvest. And then we looked at early September. I think it was the 8th of September that we had a sort of a late, so what we'd regard as a late sowing date, but what often happens in our conditions when you get a wet harvest. And at each of those sowing dates, we sowed 2 cover crops. We chose mustard as an example of a relatively fast-growing non-legume cover crop. It could have been any non-legume. It could have been radish or phacelia as well, but we just chose mustard. It's one that we've a bit of experience with here. And then as an example of a legume, we chose hairy vetch, because we know it grows well and it's quite winter hardy, and it's not going to get killed off by frost. But we just wanted the 2 contrasting cover crop types, a legume and a non-legume, and we just chose those 2 as examples of each of those.
Okay, some people, I suppose, might argue, geez, you should have used maybe a mix of plants, use 4 or 5 or maybe 6 or maybe a 10-way mix. A lot of people would suggest that that's a better way of going. You decided not to go down that route?
Yeah, we 2 reasons for that. I suppose, first of all, we wanted to do quite a bit of work on the cover crop going into as it was ploughed down into the soil, and spring barley crop sown over it. We wanted to follow the breakdown of the cover crop, and when you use mixtures, that can get a little bit tricky. But I suppose the second reason is that there isn't a huge amount of scientific evidence to suggest that mixtures of cover crops are hugely better than monocultures. I was reading a summary of work that was done from studies around the world there recently, and they looked at the effect of mixtures versus having just the individual components grown separately, and they didn't really find any consistent benefit of the mixtures over the individual varieties grown on the individual species grown on their own. So we chose not to. But obviously, if you're growing for GLOS or EFA, you have to grow a mixture of 2, and it's probably not bad practice to grow more than 1 for a species in case 1 doesn't grow very well. But just for the particular experiment we were doing, we wanted to keep it simple and not get overly complicated, to allow us to follow things through the next spring barley crop.
Okay, so in terms of growth, then you found very big differences then between the different sowing dates. You might maybe run us through that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we expected differences, but probably not differences as big as we got. So right from the get-go, that zone in early August or mid-August is obviously going to be emerging in warmer conditions with longer day length, and obviously temperature and light are what drive growth. Whereas something that's sown in early September is emerging in cooler temperatures and shorter days. But right from the get-go, there was quite significant differences between the growth of the different sowing dates. And we measured, we actually went out and took samples out of the crop at a couple of stages during the year. But if we just look maybe we took a set of samples in early December when growth is more or less finished at that stage. The cover crop isn't going to grow much more than that. And for example, the mustard that we measured the growth of the mustard at that stage. And the crop of mustard that was sown on the 30th of July was yielding about 4.5 tons per hectare of dry matter, whereas something that was sown in just 3 weeks later, in mid-August, the 18th of August, was yielding 2.5 tons per hectare. And again, when we delayed the sowing date 3 weeks more to early September, we were losing another 2 tons per hectare, and we're only getting 0.5 of a ton per hectare. So we're basically dropping 2 tons per hectare of dry matter for every 3 weeks we delayed sowing in that particular trial. Now, it might be different in different seasons, and we'll repeat it again this year to see what happens, but it was certainly a very dramatic reduction in growth, and anyone that looks at the video will visually see those huge differences.
Very, very big differences. And I suppose the very striking difference, I suppose, was the fact that your mustard that you planted in late July was flowering, I suppose, in late September, was it, or mid-September? Is that a worry for farmers in terms of people might be a bit nervous of sowing them too early, with a possibility of getting too big of a canopy to a degree, and maybe having seed return coming back from them?
Yeah, well, that is a risk. Now, the crop did flower. It did actually produce seed. It was the first time I'd actually seen mustard to actually produce seed in the pods, but the seed never matured, and it never got to a stage where it ripened. If you like, you're not going to ripen a huge amount of seed in the middle of December, which is when it would have been sort of ripening. But it's certainly an issue. It's potentially an issue, and you probably need to choose your species fairly carefully if you're sowing very early and going to allow the crop to grow for a long period. In terms of the actual biomass, that's not I'm not so sure that's such a big issue. And in terms of getting benefits from cover crops, the more biomass you can grow, the better. In our case, we didn't have any problems ploughing down the material directly without any pre-treatment such as chopping or spraying off, and we were able to get a very good coverage of the crop in the plough-based system.
Okay. And in all of the different sowing dates, was there a differential between them in terms of the crop's performance against weeds? Were they able to suppress weeds, I suppose, in essence?
Yeah, there was a very big difference. So the last sowing date in early September grew very slowly, and the weeds were able to get established and were able to produce a lot of biomass in that sowing date. So when we measured the crop in December, 60 to 80% of what was actually there was weeds rather than what was sown cover crop. Whereas when we looked at the earlier sowing dates, the amount of weeds was quite small. The late July sowing date had virtually no weeds in it because the crop was just so vigorous the weeds couldn't compete against it, and the mid-August sowing date had very, very little weeds as well. So there was certainly the later you went, the more weeds and less sown cover crop that you ended up with.
Okay. And I suppose many farmers in that circumstance would regard volunteer cereals as a weed. Now, potentially you could argue it's growing good biomass, but did you get rid of the volunteer cereals, or I suppose firstly, were they a problem? And if they were, did you get rid of them? And maybe a secondary question for a farmer on the ground, should they be concerned about lots of volunteers coming through from the point of view of disease carryover and that kind of thing?
Yeah, there was very few of volunteers in the crop coming up to after December, if you like. Now that said, we had some problems in the very early sowing date. We had some problems with just behind the combine. There was an awful lot of volunteers that were actually killing our they were over competing with the cover crops, so we actually had to go in and spray them off, or otherwise we were just going to have strips of barley and strips of cover crop. But in an adjacent trial, we didn't spray off the barley, and it had all died by time we came to plough our crop in February. But certainly, if the barley was still green, or the volunteers, be they barley or wheat volunteers, were still green, you might be worried about a carryover of disease or aphids, and in that case, you'd probably spray off your cover crop, in whatever December or January, and have it well killed before you did incorporate it.
And when we talk about the end of season scenario, I think you might have mentioned a little bit about it, but you might just give us an outline of how you managed the large crop and the small crop at the end of the season in terms of going in for the next crop.
Yeah, as I said, we were in a plough-based system, so we decided we wouldn't use glyphosate, given that there's some concerns about the future of glyphosate. We said, well, we'll see what would happen if we didn't have access to glyphosate. So we decided not to spray off with glyphosate, and we just ploughed them in directly, and we did plough them in quite close to sowing. Again, we wanted to see what would happen if in a situation you were forced into incorporating quite close to sowing. But we didn't have any problems. The plough gave quite good coverage of all the material. It would actually have been very difficult to have gone out into the field and shown where the plots had been sown without having a spade and doing quite a bit of digging to actually dig up the covered material.
Okay. And if you were in a non-plough based system, what would your approach have been?
Well, I think if we were in a non-plough based system, we would probably have had to spray off with glyphosate at some stage, probably a good bit before we sowed the cover crop, just to try and manage that biomass. If it was just the mustard, you'd probably get away with chopping. If it had flowered, you'd probably get away with chopping. It's probably not going to regrow, provided there wasn't any weeds, weed grasses or whatever in the field. In our field, we didn't have. I should have mentioned that we didn't have any perennial weed grasses in present either, like scotch or that we would have had to use glyphosate in that situation.
So when all that's considered, Richie, and I know the trials are still ongoing, and in fairness, you've been doing trials probably for the last 10 or more years, let's say, on this. From what you know and you understand about cover crops at the moment, is it worthwhile for farmers to consider planting cover crops? And I suppose really in the absence of a financial incentive, if you like, for first and foremost.
Well, I think there is an environmental benefit to growing cover crops. I mentioned the reduction in nitrate nitrate loss that cover crops give, and that's going to come more to the fore as we go forward. So there's definitely an environmental benefit, but I suppose one of the problems is in terms of agronomic benefits. It's quite difficult to show consistent agronomic benefits due solely to cover crops. And given that if you're actually sowing a cover crop, you're incurring a seed cost and some sort of machinery cost, as well as perhaps a destruction cost. If you're not getting a benefit afterwards, the benefits, the economic benefits are marginal at best. So it's certainly something to consider. Sow a cover crop, but you just need to take careful rein of any costs that you incur and try maximize the amount of growth that you're getting from the cover crops, so that you maximize your chances of getting a benefit in either soil properties or in the succeeding crop.
Okay, so the same in everything, Richie. If you're going to do it properly, if you like.
Pretty much, yeah. If you don't do it properly, your chances of getting a benefit are quite slim.
Kind of wasting your money. Richie, thank you very much for your time. It's a really fascinating topic, I suppose, in the sense of I think an awful lot more farmers probably will be doing it, whether they like it or not. Maybe with some of the maybe the new rules that are coming at everybody. So look, all the research that you're doing is certainly going to feed into the best management of that. Richie, thanks again for your time, and we'll be chatting to you again.
Thank you.
That's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Richie for joining me today. Remember to keep farm safety high in the agenda, especially as children are still on holidays, as they may venture a bit closer to machinery operations than you might like. It's a busy time, and tiredness often follows long working hours, and this can allow slips in safety awareness, potentially resulting in mistakes and accidents. So take regular breaks and keep safety for yourself, your loved ones, and employees to the forefront of your mind. And finally, don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.